"You're a murderer!" The words tore through the park like a rifle crack. Loud, public, laced with venom. A nearby toddler began to cry. The wind paused in the trees. The morning joggers stopped moving, sneakers crunching to silence on the gravel. The old man stood alone, tall, steady, hat shadowing his eyes. His right hand frozen mid-salute, facing the flag that danced gently in the summer breeze above the memorial stones. His cane rested against the stone bench behind him, beside a small, folded American flag. The name stitched on his cap, United States Army, now the target of an open fury. "You think wearing that cap makes you noble?" she shouted again, storming closer. "You trained others to kill. You pushed buttons, signed papers, gave orders. That makes you a murderer." Her voice cracked, but didn't break. The rage held firm. She stood inches from him now, a clenched fist, a trembling finger. Her face flush with outrage, as if she carried ghosts in her throat. The man didn't move. Not to defend, not to speak. His hand remained raised, fingers trembling slightly in salute. Not for her, not for himself. The flag rippled behind him, red, white and blue brushing the wind like breath through a memory. The woman's voice turned shrill. "Don't you dare salute in front of me!" And then, footsteps. Boots, slow, heavy, measured. From the far side of the park, someone was coming. Not running, not shouting, approaching. A voice, calm, steady, from behind her. "Step away from him." She turned sharply. The soldier approaching wasn't a stranger. She was his daughter. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. His name was Harlan Weaver, 86 years old, retired lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. He'd seen 2 wars, 4 campaigns, and more funerals than birthdays in his adult life. He wasn't a loud man, never had been. But even as the years bent his back and hollowed his stride, he never missed a Thursday at the memorial bench. Not once. Every week, at 10 in the morning, he would make the slow walk through the maple-lined trail that curved like a respectful bow toward the heart of the park. And when he reached the small stone bench, the one that bore the engraved names of his unit, he'd sit, remove his cap, and place a small folded flag beside him, always folded perfectly, always with clean hands. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't cry. He simply sat with the dead. To those who passed by, families with strollers, teenagers with earbuds, retirees walking dogs on slack leashes, he was a quiet fixture. Familiar, but easy to overlook. Some nodded, some ignored him. But a few, always a few, would pause, just briefly, to offer a nod of their own. A silent thank you, a moment of recognition. But not her, not today. She wasn't part of the rhythm of the park. She'd arrived like a storm cloud, sudden, sharp, and full of electric judgment. The moment she saw the old man in uniform, something inside her erupted, something long held and bitter, and she had brought her fury to his feet like a flag of her own, not to honor, but to condemn. Harlan didn't know her name. He didn't recognize her face, but her anger was not new to him. In another life, it had stared out through tear-streaked faces of foreign children. It had burned behind the eyes of soldiers who came home and couldn't sleep. He had known rage like this, just not so close, not so personal. Behind her, the small crowd began to form, scattered witnesses, frozen by the collision between an elderly man's stillness and a stranger's fire. No one moved to intervene. Not yet. Some lowered their eyes. Others watched, hearts caught between sympathy and fear. Harlan stayed seated. The sun slipped behind a cloud, softening the morning light. The flag beside him lifted gently, as though stirred by memory. And still, the woman raged. She didn't see the soldier coming up behind her. But Harlan did. She hadn't planned to see this, but she saw everything. The air had been gentler earlier that morning, a crisp breeze moving through the sycamores, carrying the scent of damp earth and trimmed grass. It was the kind of day that made the park feel alive but quiet, like a place that whispered rather than shouted. Harlan Weaver moved slowly beneath the tree-lined path, the tip of his cane clicking softly on the stone with each step. He wore the same pressed olive shirt he always did, sleeves rolled just above the wrist, with a plain gold watch peeking out beneath the cuff. His cap read simply, "United States Army," nothing else. He nodded once to the groundskeeper near the entrance, a younger man with earbuds in who always paused to wave when Harlan passed. Then came the usual sights: the old Labrador retriever dozing near the fountain, the pair of sisters speed-walking in matching windbreakers, and the college kid who sometimes sketched on a bench but never made eye contact. Routine faces, predictable movements. That was the rhythm he liked. That was the silence he had earned. He stopped briefly by the small oak tree with the broken limb, the one planted by the Rotary Club after the war. He adjusted the strap on his watch, exhaled through his nose, then resumed walking. A slight limp in the right leg still slowed him, though he never spoke of it. That limp had started in a muddy field east of Quezon in the summer of 1968, and it had followed him across half a century without complaint. As he neared the brass-plated bench, his bench, the park opened wider, revealing a grassy stretch where a group of younger adults had laid out blankets. They looked like students, maybe activists, or simply regular folks enjoying the morning. But Harlan noticed the change immediately, not in what they did, but in what they didn't. One of the men whispered something to another. Then came a laugh, too loud, too deliberate. Another voice chimed in, low and mocking. "Here comes the fossil again, the war lover." He didn't flinch. He didn't glance in their direction. He simply took the final few steps and reached the bench. The cane tapped twice against the concrete before he turned, settled, and lowered himself slowly into place. He set the cane beside him, reached into his breast pocket, and pulled out the folded flag. His fingers moved with reverence, thumbs guiding the creases back into alignment as though smoothing old memories. Across the field, one of the women, short hair, sharp features, restless energy, had risen to her feet. She was pacing now, watching him, not curious, not reflective, watching with tension in her spine and judgment in her mouth. But Harlan didn't look at her. He adjusted his cap slightly, rested the flag gently beside him, and let his hands settle on his knees. The sunlight glinted off the nameplate on the bench, a line of brass etched with 7 names and a single rank. His rank, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. A gust of wind moved through the park then, and the trees shifted like old soldiers adjusting formation. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. A jogger's shoes pattered along the trail. The ordinary continued, until it didn't. The woman began walking toward him, slow at first, then faster. The others on the grass did not follow. One of them looked down. Another pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. They weren't laughing anymore, not visibly, but none stood, not even when she reached the path. Harlan reached for the flag again, not to hold it, but to raise his hand above it. His salute was not for show, not a performance. It was private, even when done in public. A promise whispered into motion, a habit of the heart. But now, the footsteps approached harder. "Hey, old man!" The voice cut through the field like a blade. "You think this is a place to worship violence?" He didn't respond. He kept his hand steady, his gaze fixed beyond her, toward the flagpole near the pond, just visible between 2 trees. The woman came closer. Her face twisted with anger, or maybe pain. Her hands clenched at her sides. Her voice rose again. "How many people did you kill to earn this little bench in the sun?" Still, no answer. Harlan didn't look at her. He simply finished the salute and lowered his hand. Across the park, the others had begun to notice. A stroller wheel paused in the gravel. A cyclist stopped at the edge of the path, pretending to check his tire. The tension was no longer passing. It was anchored now, coiled around the space like barbed wire. And still, no one stood. Not yet. The sound of gravel under boots shifted from steady rhythm to confrontation. Her footsteps landed sharp, deliberate, unyielding, the way someone walks when they've already decided the verdict and now only need to deliver the sentence. The woman's eyes didn't just glare. They searched for something to destroy, something in him that could be broken loudly enough to silence her own thoughts. Harlan looked up for the first time, just slightly, enough to see her face under the soft brim of his cap. Her hands were trembling, not with weakness, with fury. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, like someone chasing a memory they could never outrun. "You hear me?" she said again, voice cracking with a blend of scorn and grief. "I said, what gives you the right to sit here and act proud? What did you do to earn this place?" Harlan didn't speak. His left hand slowly moved toward his lap, steadying the flag so it wouldn't fall. He kept it upright, like the silence deserved protecting. "You think sitting here with a flag makes you good?" she continued. "You think a hat erases what you did?" Her voice turned shrill now. "My cousin died in Fallujah because people like you taught others how to kill." Someone near the trail whispered to a companion. A couple sitting on a bench exchanged uncertain glances. A dog whimpered. A little girl, halfway through a melting ice cream cone, turned toward the scene and froze. Her mother pulled her gently away. The woman stepped closer, closing the distance until the toe of her boot touched the edge of the concrete pad where the bench stood. Her shadow fell across the brass nameplate. "You trained killers. You watched people die. And you want us to honor you for it," she spat. "You're not a hero. You're a murderer with a seat." That word, loud, bitter, final, hung in the air like smoke in a church. Harlan's shoulders didn't flinch. He reached down for the cap that had slipped slightly off his brow, and as he did, his cane shifted from where it leaned and clattered softly to the ground. He tried to catch it mid-fall, but it was already gone. The flag trembled slightly on his knee. No one moved. Not yet. The woman's voice took on a bitter edge now, almost laughing in its cruelty. "Go ahead. Pick up your little soldier hat. Give us another performance, old man. That's what you all do best, right? Pretend honor covers everything." Then, a movement sharp and deliberate. She reached forward, snatched the cap from his knee, and tossed it behind her. Gasps shot through the park like a pulse. Harlan blinked slowly. His lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. His body stiffened, not in fear, but in memory, the posture of discipline overtaking the fragility of age. He leaned carefully forward to reach for his cane, but her voice returned, louder now, shaking with what felt like long-held rage. "Don't you dare salute in front of me!" Her hand came up in a slap, not striking his face, but swiping at his raised arm as he tried once again to deliver that quiet gesture of remembrance. The flag nearly slipped from his lap. He caught it, barely, then folded it tighter against his chest. His voice, gravel rough and low, finally emerged. "You don't know what we carried back with us." But she didn't listen. "Murderer!" she screamed. The word hit the trees. The branches seemed to still, even the wind paused. And then, a different sound. Boots, not hers, from behind. They were slower, firmer, not angry but steady, controlled. The woman didn't hear them yet. She was too wrapped in fire to notice the shadow moving behind her. But Harlan's eyes did. His hands stilled. His breath steadied. The voice behind her didn't shout. It didn't rise. It simply spoke. That's far enough. And the woman stopped mid-rant, frozen in place by the calmness in the voice she hadn't expected to hear. She turned around, confused, startled, defensive, and saw who stood behind her. She didn't yet know who the soldier was, but Harlan did. And everything in the park changed in that instant. The silence after the confrontation did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as though the entire park had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting to see what would break first, the old man's composure or the sky itself. The cap lay in the grass a few feet away, brim down, dust settling lightly on the crown. The woman stood rigid now, her chest still heaving from the force of her outburst, but her eyes darted with the realization that something behind her had changed. A shift in pressure, not wind, presence. But Harlan did not look at her anymore. Instead, he reached down for his cane, slowly, carefully, his hand tracing the familiar grooves in the worn wood. He lifted it back into place beside him, like someone restoring order in a world that had been briefly, violently tilted. Then, with great care, he lifted the small flag from his lap, brushed off the faint particles of dirt that had landed during the scuffle, and folded it tighter, not with ceremonial precision, but with reverent instinct. His hands were shaking now, slightly more than before, but his back remained straight, and his eyes stayed on the flagpole in the distance, where the breeze stirred the stars and stripes like a whispered memory. He adjusted the flag until it sat neatly on his lap once again. Then he sat back, not in defeat, but in defiance of chaos. Not the kind of defiance that roars, but the kind that simply stays still when it would be easier to fall apart. A small breath escaped his lips, the kind that only those closest would hear, those who had learned that holding steady was sometimes the last form of strength left. His cap remained on the ground. He didn't move to retrieve it. He simply sat in the sunlight, shoulders squared, legs still. His eyes closed for a moment, not to retreat, but to return. Somewhere far away, a jungle maybe, a trench, a field of names whispered at dusk, places that never fully left those who survived them. Behind him, the voice that had cut through the morning like a blade was suddenly absent. The woman had gone still. She hadn't turned yet. She hadn't spoken again. Even the others nearby, who had once smirked and shifted nervously, now sat in uncomfortable silence, like children caught misbehaving in a place too sacred to defile. No apology came, no explanation, but neither did anger from Harlan. He simply remained, the flag on his lap, the cane beside him, the breeze lifting the corners of the leaves overhead, and behind it all, a presence. The boots had stopped, not because their owner hesitated, but because she was watching. Standing a few paces away, arms at her sides, was a woman in uniform. Tall, strong, eyes shaded behind dark glasses that she slowly removed. She had not yet spoken again. She did not need to. Not yet. She was watching the man on the bench, not the woman in front of him, and her eyes did not blink, because the man on the bench was more than a figure in her sight. He was her father, and she had waited long enough. Eleanor Weaver stood tall. Her boots were planted on the edge of the flagstone path, heels squared, palms flat against the side seams of her pressed trousers. The crisp uniform of the United States Army clung to her shoulders like armor, not as decoration, but as memory sewn into fabric. She wore no expression, only silence. That was enough. She had seen the last 30 seconds in perfect clarity. The insult, the shouting, the slap, the fall of her father's cap. She had watched from the shade of the maple trees, half hidden behind a bronze statue of a kneeling soldier. She hadn't planned to reveal herself. Not yet. Her father always preferred peace to pageantry. But then the woman raised her hand, and that had been the moment. Now she stepped forward, not in a rush, not with fury, just deliberate steps, each one echoing with the quiet precision of someone trained not to escalate, but to end. The woman, still mid-breath from her last accusation, turned sharply at the sound of boots behind her. The tension in her face turned quickly to something else. Surprise, maybe even fear. The way a person stumbles into a truth they weren't ready to face. "Oh, perfect," the woman muttered, her voice lower now, bitter. "Another uniform. Maybe you two can compare notes. Share a few medals." Elena didn't answer. She stopped just short of the bench, between the woman and the seated man, then reached up and slowly removed her sunglasses. Her eyes, revealed now, were steady and brown, like earth that had seen drought, fire, and flood, but still held its shape. "That man," she said quietly, "is my father." The woman blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Her tone held the weight of law, not the kind written in books, but the kind passed down through time in the eyes of daughters who've watched good men bear burdens silently. You just struck a decorated combat veteran. You knocked his cane away. You disrespected the flag, and you did it in a federal memorial park. Her words were not threats. They were simple truths. The group on the grass, who had earlier laughed and exchanged quiet jabs, was now frozen. One of them shifted awkwardly. Another stood up, only to sit right back down again. The park felt different now. Not louder, just stiller. Even the birds seemed to perch more quietly on the overhead branches, as if instinctively aware something sacred had just taken place. The woman's face shifted. Her certainty, once fiery, now trembled at the edges. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, loosened. She took a step back, eyes flicking between Elena and Harlan, whose gaze had not yet lifted. Elena took one more step forward, not aggressive, just unyielding. Her voice softened, just slightly. You have every right to feel whatever it is you feel. I don't know your story. I don't pretend to. A pause. But what you did, that wasn't justice. That was assault. The woman opened her mouth to respond, perhaps to protest, perhaps to explain, but no words came. Only a thin shake of her head, as if what she was facing now didn't fit neatly into the version of the world she had carried with her. And behind it all, Harlan remained still, not out of weakness, but because he knew something the world had forgotten. Sometimes the loudest statement is no statement at all. Elena remained where she was, between the woman and her father, not blocking, but guarding. The line had been crossed, and she was the line now. Elena didn't have to raise her voice. Her very presence had begun to rearrange the atmosphere. The space around the bench, once crackling with tension, was now filled with something else. Authority drawn not from dominance, but from earned purpose. She stood perfectly still, her shoulders squared, the patch on her uniform catching a ray of sunlight that filtered through the oak leaves above. Her fingers curled loosely at her sides, but her spine remained tall, as if the memory of every morning drill, every field deployment, every hard-earned salute stood at attention within her. The woman across from her, once ablaze with fury, now looked as if she'd stepped into a mirror and seen something unexpected. Her anger hadn't disappeared, but it had begun to unravel. What remained was confusion, tightly wound around something like shame. Elena took one step forward, closing the space between them, not to intimidate, but to command presence. Her voice came steady, measured, unmistakably military in its cadence. You saw a uniform, she said, and you decided that meant war, that it meant blood, that it meant guilt. A beat passed. She didn't blink. But you didn't see the man in it. The woman opened her mouth, but the words caught. She faltered, eyes flicking toward the ground, then back up at Harlan, who still sat in silence. He had not yet looked at her. He had not moved since retrieving the flag. Elena gestured slightly behind her, toward the bench. That man taught me to walk before he taught me to salute. He held my hand through a fever at 4 years old. He cooked eggs every Sunday after church. He read the names of every man he lost out loud once a month, because he said forgetting them would be the second time they died. Her voice didn't quiver. That man, she continued, fought in Korea, in Vietnam. He came home and never once asked for thanks, never once talked about what he saw. But he comes here every Thursday to remember the men who didn't get to grow old. A long pause. You knocked his cap off, she said quietly, as if that would erase any of that. The woman's breath caught. Her hands now trembled by her sides. The bravado, once so present in her stance, had melted into something unspoken, a fragile unraveling. Then slowly, Elena turned her back on her, not out of dismissal, but out of trust that no further words were needed, and faced her father. Harlan's head had tilted slightly now. He was watching her, not with surprise, not even with pride, just familiarity, like recognizing a reflection in water after years of stillness. She knelt beside him, one knee grounded in the gravel, and reached for his cap. She dusted it gently, her fingers brushing away the soil as if tending to something sacred. Then, with both hands, she placed it back on his head, adjusting it with care. Only then did Harlan speak. His voice was gravelly, soft, as though unused for hours or days. "Didn't expect to see you today," he said. Eleanor smiled, just faintly. "Didn't expect to be needed." He nodded once. Not in agreement, but in shared understanding. Between them, years moved unspoken. Deployment letters, long-distance calls, quiet pride disguised as stoicism. The air around them shifted again. Footsteps approached, slower this time. A figure in a light brown uniform stood at the edge of the walkway. A park officer. His badge caught the sun, but he didn't say a word. He simply stood there, hands at his belt, watching, waiting. The woman didn't speak again. Not yet. Her voice had burned out. What replaced it was a hesitant glance, a weight she now had to carry, one of her own making. Behind her, the group on the grass had fallen silent. Some of them had stood. One had pulled his hood over his head. The others remained still. And there, in the middle of the park, between fallen leaves and the flag flapping gently above them, Harlan sat upright, the cap back on his head, the flag folded once more across his lap. The world had not shouted back on his behalf, but it had answered. And the woman who once screamed alone now stood alone in the quiet. Elena remained beside her father, her knees slowly rising from the gravel as she returned to a standing posture, crisp, controlled, and now settled into stillness. She didn't look at the woman anymore. She didn't need to. That part was over. Harlan sat unmoving, the folded flag resting in his lap like a sacred document. His fingers lightly pressed into the creases, worn hands now steady. His gaze wasn't fixed on anyone in particular, not on the trees, not on the woman who had accused him, not on the other park-goers watching from benches or shaded trails. He was somewhere else now, somewhere behind his eyes. Eleanor gently rested a hand on the top rail of the bench behind him, not to support herself but to anchor him, just in case he needed it, just in case her presence was more than a shield. "I'm here, Pop," she whispered. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Not broken, not hardened, just present. Around them, the atmosphere had changed. There were no whispers, no murmurs, only quiet. Even the birds had softened their songs. A sparrow landed nearby and paused, hopping twice, then took off again, wings fluttering silently between branches. The woman, Kendra, took a single step backward. Her shoulders had collapsed inward, no longer drawn by fury, but weighed down by something else. Her lips pressed together, the tight line of defiance now cracked around the edges. She looked at the folded flag, then at Elena. Her expression flickered. Not apology, not remorse, just recognition. That, maybe, she had not understood the man she had yelled at. She turned away without another word. Elena didn't watch her go. She only exhaled, long and controlled, her shoulders lowering by a hair's breadth. She reached for the side pocket of her uniform, retrieved a soft cloth, and without a word began wiping her father's glasses. Harlan, eyes blinking, adjusted slightly on the bench. His knee twitched, an old ache announcing its return, but he made no sound of complaint. Elena handed the glasses back without ceremony. He accepted them in silence. "You drove all the way from Fort Hood?" he asked after a long minute. She gave the smallest smile, almost hidden. "Flew. Took some leave. I needed air." He nodded again. "Plenty of it here," he muttered, eyes on the open field ahead. She sat down beside him at last. They didn't need a reunion, not in words. They had sat like this before, in hospital waiting rooms, in long silences before deployments, on front porches with the sound of wind chimes tapping behind them. Their language had always been spare, but it never lacked weight. From the bench across the path, a man who had watched everything now shifted forward. He was older, perhaps in his early 70s, with a light windbreaker zipped halfway up and a set of car keys dangling from his index finger. His posture was cautious, not timid, as he slowly approached. He stopped a few feet away. "I'm sorry," he said. Not to Harlan, not to Elena, but perhaps to both, or neither. Then he stepped back again, giving them their space. Just the act of saying it seemed to ground him. The park remained still. On the path, a man with a golden retriever on a red leash slowed as he passed. He gave a small nod toward the bench, more solemn than friendly. Elena nodded back. The man walked on. The soldier and the veteran sat quietly beneath the dappled shadows of the trees. Nothing more needed to be said, but something had shifted. Something quiet, something invisible and true. And at the edge of the walkway, the officer who had arrived earlier remained, still watching. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't needed to. His hands were still clasped loosely at his belt. He gave the smallest of nods toward Elena. Not official, not formal, just acknowledgement. Then, like a quiet guardian, he turned and walked the path again, disappearing beneath the canopy. The moment had passed, but the silence it left behind had changed the park. The wind shifted, just slightly, enough to rustle the grass beneath the memorial bench, enough to flutter the low-hanging flag atop the pole in the distance. The morning haze had lifted fully now, the light falling clear and long across the stone path. Every element of the park seemed quieter, as though nature itself had taken a breath it wasn't ready to exhale. Harlan remained seated, his cap angled forward, gaze set somewhere between memory and sky. Elena stayed beside him, still in uniform, still upright, but her posture had softened, like armor that had been lowered without being removed. A shuffle came from across the walkway. The man who had paused earlier, the one in the windbreaker, took another step forward. His hands were empty now. No keys, no pretense. Only a posture of consideration and a shadow of hesitation in his eyes. He stopped just a few feet from them and looked down at the brass plaque embedded into the bench. He knelt slightly, not all the way, but just enough to run a calloused fingertip along the engraving. Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, Da Nang, 1969. He exhaled through his nose, eyes softening. "I knew that name," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, to Harlan. "Lieutenant Colonel Weaver, you were my CO." Harlan lifted his eyes slowly. No flicker of surprise. Just a long gaze that settled on the man's face with the careful study of a man who had once memorized maps, coordinates, and expressions all the same. "You were Corporal Langston," he said after a pause. The man nodded. Once, sharply. "I was the radio operator in Hill 32. You pulled me out after the fire swept through. The comms tent was gone, most of the others too. There was a hush around them. It wasn't that anyone had gathered or that a crowd had formed. It was the way time narrowed. The park seemed to fold around the three of them like a page turning to reveal something lost between chapters." Langston cleared his throat, his voice catching. "I never said thank you," he admitted. Harlan tilted his head just slightly. "You were 17, he said. "You weren't supposed to be there." Langston let out a dry, rueful chuckle. "None of us were." Elena watched them both now, not as a soldier, not even as a daughter, but as a witness to something ancient, a bond sealed long before she was born, one forged not through storytelling, but survival. Langston stood up slowly, hand pressing against his thigh. His joints resisted, but he ignored them. He looked around the park, eyes glassing slightly. "They don't build men like that anymore," he said softly, not to flatter, but to document. And then he said it again, to the air. "To hold your line when everyone else fades back. That's something." He turned toward Harlan, saluted. Not crisp, not military grade, but from the heart. Then he nodded once to Elena and walked away without waiting for applause. From the far side of the park, a young couple had stopped their walk. They didn't approach, but they watched. The man placed a hand gently on his partner's shoulder. They stayed a moment longer, then continued walking, slower, quieter. Back at the bench, Elena looked to her father. His hands now rested atop the flag, still folded, still undisturbed. He didn't speak for a while. The breeze moved again. Then, with a quiet breath, he said, "I come here every week for the ones I couldn't bring home." His voice carried no drama, no self-pity, just truth, worn and settled like stone beneath moss. Elena nodded, and in that moment, something lifted from the air. Not gone, not erased, but lighter, like weight finally acknowledged. Around them, the space had filled, not with bodies, but with presence. And for the first time that day, Harlan Weaver wasn't the only one sitting to remember. It began with the wildflowers. 3 days after the confrontation in the park, someone placed a small bouquet on the bench, loose stems tied together with a length of twine. They weren't purchased, but gathered. Field daisies, purple clover, a few dandelions not yet gone to seed. There was no card, no signature, only silence. The next morning, a young woman with a stroller paused before the bench. Her child, no older than 2, pointed toward the folded flag resting on Harlan's lap. The mother bent slightly, whispered something into the boy's ear. The boy nodded solemnly, as if understanding, though he could not, and waved to Harlan before toddling along the gravel path. Harlan said nothing. He never did. But he nodded in return, his lips barely forming a line of acknowledgement. And that was enough. By Thursday, the changes were impossible to ignore, though they remained subtle. A length of yellow ribbon had been tied to the old oak nearest the path, just beside the worn gravel where the cane always touched down. Someone had swept the leaves near the base of the bench. A thermos of coffee had been left on the far end, untouched but still warm when he arrived. There were no announcements, no articles, no social media posts. But the town knew, and the park, without ever meaning to, had become a place of remembering. On Friday, Harlan returned as he always did. Not at dawn, not at noon. Always at 10, just as the sun broke fully through the tops of the elms. He moved with the same quiet precision, his cane tapping in rhythm, his steps measured but firm. The flag was carried in the crook of his elbow. The same cap shaded his brow. But this time, he was not the first to arrive. A young man in a reserve uniform sat 2 benches down, spine straight, eyes forward. When Harlan approached, the man rose immediately. He didn't speak. He didn't salute. He simply nodded and returned to his seat, facing the path. By midday, 3 more veterans had joined. They came without coordination, one with a limp, one with a service dog, one with a faded tattoo of an eagle on his forearm. None of them claimed the bench. That still belonged to Harlan. But they sat nearby, like satellites around a fixed star. The woman, Kendra, did not return. But her absence was replaced by presence. The park officer from that day came by later that afternoon. Not in uniform, just khakis and a navy polo. He lingered at the edge of the path, hands in pockets, as Harlan sat with the flag folded across his knees. The officer did not interrupt. He simply made a slow circuit of the park and disappeared down the far hill. More ribbons appeared by the weekend, green and blue, tied carefully around fence rails and tree limbs. A paper crane was left near the base of the bench, delicately folded, wings poised as if about to rise. The community did not perform. It did not seek to make a spectacle of the veteran whose quiet ritual had been disrupted. Instead, it did something rare. It remembered with him. Every act, the swept gravel, the wildflowers, the lingering strangers who offered small nods, built something more permanent than ceremony. This wasn't a dedication, it was a return. Respect, once passive, had become active again. And on that particular morning, as the sun painted golden streaks across the memorial stone, Elena returned too. She wore no uniform this time, just jeans and a plain white shirt. Her boots were dusty, her eyes soft. She carried a thermos in one hand, a folded chair in the other. No announcement, no embrace, just a daughter coming to sit beside her father. She didn't ask if she could join him. She simply did. And across the park, 2 other figures paused before entering the clearing. A young woman holding the hand of her grandfather, both watching with quiet admiration. They didn't approach, but they stood long enough for the old man to remove his cap, and in that gesture, another kind of bench was carved into memory, this one made of silence, service, and the weight of a folded flag. A new Thursday had come, and Harlan Weaver was no longer alone. The following Thursday arrived with silver dew still clinging to the edges of the grass. It was earlier than usual, the sun barely pushing over the hills, casting pale light through low, slow-moving clouds. The park was empty in the way early hours make things sacred, the silence not absence, but anticipation. The wind carried the faint scent of pine, earthy and sweet. But the bench wasn't empty. Not this time. Harlan Weaver sat in his usual spot, cap low on his brow, the folded flag settled once more across his lap. His posture had not changed, nor had the quiet steadiness in his face, but something around him had. The space no longer felt solitary. Beside him sat a boy, maybe 9 years old, legs too short to reach the ground, heels swinging just slightly above the soil. A spiral notebook rested on his lap, and in his small fingers, a pencil worked diligently across the page. He wasn't drawing something abstract. He was drawing the flagpole. Each line was careful, honest. No flair, no flourish, just attention. Harlan glanced at the boy once, but said nothing. His presence alone was acknowledgement. The boy didn't look up, but a smile curved at the corner of his mouth, as if he could feel the approval without needing to hear it. A few feet away, Elena sat on a worn quilt laid out over the grass. She had removed her boots and tucked them beneath the fabric, her legs folded beneath her in quiet repose. She wasn't reading this time. She simply watched. She watched the breeze move the leaves, watched the notebook fill with lines, watched the steady, constant breath of a man who had once walked through jungles and deserts and now sat beneath a single tree, beside a single boy, on a single morning, and was seen. Joggers passed now and then. Most slowed. One man, lean, in his 50s, sweat already soaking his collar, saluted without breaking stride. Harlan didn't see it, but Elena did, and she nodded, faintly. A woman with a paper bag of groceries stopped at the base of the hill and simply remained there for a moment, her arms hugged around the bundle, eyes lifted toward the flag. And somewhere in the canopy, a bird began to sing, soft, rhythmic. The kind of melody that doesn't draw attention but rewards those who are already still. Then, without prompting, the boy beside Harlan closed his notebook, looked up and whispered, "You salutin' again today, mister." Harlan's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Every day, son," he said. He adjusted his cap, placed his hand on the flag. And then, slow and steady as time itself, Harlan Weaver lifted his right arm. His hand rose to his temple, fingers flat, palm slightly turned, and he saluted. Not to be seen, not to teach, but to remember. And on that Thursday morning, beneath the same sky he had walked under for 86 years, Harlan Weaver was no longer part of the past. He was tradition, living, breathing, and quietly passed on. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.